Welcome to another edition of Up Close. My name is Tepa Mutekuwa. Up Close is a daily current affairs show that profiles men and women making waves in their industries and gives newsmakers a human face. The program also gives newsmakers a platform where they can share their stories, vision, and even tackle uneasy concerns without scorn or vilification. Stay tuned with us for the next 30 minutes as we talk to Dean Peacock, the co-founder and executive director of Sonke Gender Justice Network, joining us from our Cape Town studios. Dean Peacock has been an activist for justice all his life. Back in 1985, he joined the End Conscription campaign to oppose conscription of white males into South Africa's apartheid army. He later worked with homeless youth in Nicaragua and also worked with perpetrators of domestic violence in jails in San Francisco. And Dean, that is where I'm going to end it in terms of introducing you to our viewers. So I think to better answer who is Dean Peacock, I'm going to ask you, what prompted you to become an activist? And hello, by the way.
Hi, Tepang. Thank you so much for this invitation. It's a real honor to be on the show today on Women's Day, remembering, of course, the march now more than 50 years ago to the union building demanding justice for women in South Africa. Exactly. And interestingly enough, it was a march, a much smaller march, that really started me in some ways on my journey of social justice activism. I was in matric in high school here in Cape Town, living near the university campus at UCT, and there was lots of student activism, of course. And there'd been a big demonstration the previous day of students who'd marched down into Rondebosch, and they had been quite brutally attacked by the police, and they'd been sjamboked and tear-gassed. And so the next day, the helicopters were flying around the campus, and I was intrigued by what was going on and truthfully a little bit bored with my studies. So I wandered up onto campus and joined the march, really out of curiosity as kind of an onlooker more than anything else. And within minutes, I had been tear-gassed, and we were, running, fleeing from the police who were chasing us with shamboks. And I think it was really the first time I had come face to face with the brutality of the apartheid state. Previously, I had been kept at a distance from it. I didn't have to deal on a regular basis with the daily injustices that Black South Africans faced. And I think faced with that brutality and kind of horrified by what I was seeing, I was pushed to think more deeply about what was going on. Mm-hmm. And I was also really excited by the group of people I was with, a multiracial group of people who were, very clear they were not going to desist. They were determined. So I joined a group of students that were toy-toying on the side of the freeway and felt an excitement to be part of a social struggle that felt right. What we were doing felt immediately important and necessary. And I think that, was kind of the seminal moment that got me started in the work that I've done now for the last nearly 30 years. Let's
go back to that moment. I mean, how did it feel to get tear-gassed as, an innocent youth who is just marching for something that they felt or believed was right?
Yeah, it was terrifying. I mean, the experience of being tear-gassed for the first time is pretty frightening. You can't breathe. And we were on the main fields at UCT, and there's only a small stairway up off of those fields. And so, there were probably 1,000, 2,000 of us trying to run up a relatively narrow staircase. And so I remember feeling quite frightened, and the police kind of running across the field behind us. But mostly what I remember was the sense of outrage. It was a rainy Cape Town winter day, rather like it's been lately. And so the cars all had a thin film of water across the top of them, and we all were using that water to clear our eyes. And I remember saying to a stranger, the guy next to me, I remember saying, "Those bastards." And I just never felt so clearly the injustices of the apartheid state. And, that's part of, I think, the privilege of white South Africans growing up under apartheid is that one could know, as I did, and as I think we did in my family, that apartheid was wrong. But until you're confronted with the violence of the state, I think, it's easy to see it as something that's happening off in other communities, and easy to remain focused on the kind of immediacies of your daily life. For me as a young, student at school, that was sports and all the distractions that a middle-class kid like myself had. So what I felt in that moment, as I say, was a sense of fear, followed by outrage, and then followed by a very real sense of excitement about the possibility of joining a social movement that was so dynamic and had so much momentum. And so quickly I started going to other marches and demonstrations. I remember walking one night to hear Desmond Tutu speak in the Woodstock City Hall, and just, being caught up in the excitement of a social struggle that very quickly, I think, I could tell was going to bring about change and fundamental change.
And then life took, let's sorry to interrupt, because I want to get as much of your story in the time that we have. So let's move on. Life takes you in another direction. You end up in Nicaragua, but you don't stop being a social activist even there.
Yeah, I was lucky. I became an AFS exchange student. So I lived in a very small town in the south of Bolivia for a year. With a working class family, and there were, many days, particularly in winter, when the family didn't really have enough food. And so I was very fortunate to gain a kind of different perspective on what it means to not have access to, daily necessities like food. And so from there, I then moved to the US. My family had moved to the US at the beginning of 1986. And I was again fortunate. I went to the University of California at Berkeley, which has a long and proud tradition of social justice activism. And so I got swept up in the anti-apartheid movement there. I was part of SAISCO, the South African International Students Congress, and met many prominent ANC leaders. I was extremely fortunate to meet Chris Hani through SAISCO, and we hosted him on campus. And I then got caught up in became very active in efforts to stop US imperialism and US aggression in Central America. At that point, the US was constantly threatening to invade Nicaragua, and following that, of course, the Gulf War in 1991. So my activism became, in some ways, a little bit more internationalist in its focus, and I was able to draw the connections a little bit more clearly between oppression in South Africa, oppression in other parts of the world. And during that time, I was fortunate to be involved with a woman who was a feminist activist and who volunteered at a battered women's shelter in San Francisco. And it was through a training that she went to. One day I remember her coming back to the house and saying she had attended a training by a man from an organization called Men Overcoming Violence. And she said to me, you should check them out. They're doing really important work to address men's violence against women.
Dean, let's hold it there. Let's hold it there, because now we're moving on to the next phase of your life. I want to take a quick ad break, and we're chatting to Dean Peacock, who is the co-founder of Sonke Gender Justice. So do stay with us. You're watching Up Close on DSTV channel 404. Welcome back to Up Close, and today we're getting up close with the co-founder of Sonke Gender Justice, of course today being Women's Day. Dean, let's carry on. Now we move on to the next phase of your life. There's a woman who introduces you, or should I say maybe sensitizes you, to issues of gender inequality.
That's right. So, I, based on her suggestion that I go and meet with people at Men Overcoming Violence to learn more about the work that they were doing. I didn't do it immediately, and I started in Nicaragua, moved down to Nicaragua, where it was 1992, and 500 years of resistance to colonialism. And so I translated for the South African delegation in Nicaragua, which was a very, very exciting experience of meeting people from South Africa. I hadn't been back to South Africa at that point for nearly 7 years. And so I was living in Nicaragua working with children who were homeless. Most of them were homeless because of violence that they had experienced at home. And of course, being homeless, they experienced tremendous violence on the streets. Both the young men and the young women were regularly sexually abused in the marketplace where they slept at night. And I think I, for the first time, really had to grapple with the consequences for survivors of endemic sexual violence. And so, the young people I was working with were addicted to sniffing glue, in part to escape the daily horrors that they experienced. And so I then moved back to San Francisco and started working with homeless and runaway youth in San Francisco. And they too were on the streets because of violence at home, either abuse they had experienced as children or abuse they had witnessed their fathers perpetrate against their mothers. And so I remembered this conversation about men overcoming violence, and I was trying to figure out, what do we do to stop this violence that's putting these kids on the street? Because once those kids were on the street, even in San Francisco, they were then raped, often became addicted to drugs. And in the early 1990s, particularly those of them who were using injection drugs, ended up HIV positive without access to treatment because there was no treatment at that point. And so I was watching that trajectory of abuse at home, homelessness, abuse on the streets, HIV infection, and death.
And at the time now, so you're working, sorry, Dean, you're working for like international organizations. It's interesting because then your career path could have taken a completely different direction. How did you end up back in South Africa and back to thinking about forming an organization to deal with these issues back here at home?
Yeah, so I was actually working for a small kind of grassroots organization on the streets of San Francisco, a place called the Larkin Street Youth Center. And precisely because I recognized that it was violence at home perpetrated by men that was putting these young people I was working with on the streets, I then went and volunteered at Men Overcoming Violence. And I remember walking in the doors, it was a very modest office, and the volunteer coordinator saying, well, why are you here? Why do you want to do this work of working with men to end men's violence? And I said, well, I'm seeing the impact of that violence. And I also know that violence is a significant problem in South Africa. I want to acquire skills here that I can take back to South Africa. And it took me another 7 years to figure out how to make that happen.
Did you mean it at the time, or it was just an interview tactic to get into the job?
No, I really meant it. I really meant it.
Yes,
I remained very connected to the South African community in the Bay Area, and very involved and in sort of observing from a distance the process of change that was unfolding in 92, 93, 94 here at home. And so when I did come back to South Africa, I spent a lot of time visiting organizations. I came back essentially on holiday in 2000 and visited a number of different organizations, including a fantastic project called the 5 and 6 campaign that was being run here in Cape Town at the time, which attempted to engage men. And their approach was 5 out of 6 men are not abusive, and we need those men to speak out, to challenge the violence that a small number of men are perpetrating. And so I wrote about that, and an organization based in New York contacted me and said that they wanted me to do some work on men's violence in South Africa. And so I came and started to participate in what was then called the Men as Partners Network, and it was a national network coordinated by Planned Parenthood Association of South Africa. And it was incredibly exciting work, working with men, particularly in Gauteng, in the East Rand, in Soweto, encouraging them to start thinking about their own process of male socialization, how it felt to be young men in South Africa in the early 2000s, the pressures that they faced as they negotiated the worlds of male socialization, violence, and HIV. And so I was lucky. I had the opportunity to move back and do that work. And so I worked as the coordinator of the Men as Partners Network until 2005. And at that point, Bafana Khumalo, who was at that point at the Commission for Gender Equality, and Sharmila Wilson, who worked for the Association for Women's Development, AWID, the three of us had a conversation about starting a new organization, which we wanted to work with men and also with women. And so at that point, we formed Sonke Gender Justice. And Sonke, of course, a word that means together for all of us. And so Sonke is now 7 years old. We've been around almost exactly 7 years. And we're now 100 staff working in over 20 countries in Africa, with offices here in Cape Town, in Braamfontein, in Bushbuckridge, and in Pretoria and Guguletu. So
let's hold it there, Dean.
Journey.
Let's hold it there. I want to take another ad break, and then when we come back to the last section, I want to chat a little bit more, since it's Women's Day, why you think it's very important that men get involved in issues of gender equality, because the perception is that it's for women organizations to start that. And, to try and understand, I guess, you as a person, what type of men does it take to get involved in work that has to do with women issues? We're going to take a quick break. You're watching Up Close. Dean Peacock, co-founder of Sonke Gender Justice, is who we're having a discussion with today on Up Close, today being Women's Day, of course. Dean, let's now, try and understand the mindset of someone working with gender issues, and the perception out there is that, those are women issues. What kind of a man does it take to do that kind of work?
Yeah, it's a great question, Tsepang, and I think, part of what we believe at Sonke Gender Justice is that gender-based violence and gender inequality and the quest for gender equality, of course, are women's issues, but they're not women's issues exclusively. If I grow up in a home where there's domestic violence as a boy, men's violence against women is my issue too. If I grow up in a world where my mother is paid less than a man, even if she does the same work, that's an issue that affects everyone in that workplace. So there are issues that affect women acutely, but I think, part of what we have to do is to say that violence against women isn't just a women's issue, that in fact there's a critical part of the sentence missing when we say violence against women, and that part of the sentence is men. In South Africa and across the world, it's men's violence against women. And so we think it's really important to name that. Now, in naming that, it's of course not to say that every man uses violence against women, because we know that's not true. In fact, a majority of men don't. But I think in as much as we name gender as a women's issue, we fail to name the impact that it has on all of us, on men and women and society at large. So violence against women is bad for women, without a doubt. It's also bad for men. If I grow up in a world where women are fearful of me, I'm walking along the promenade here at Sea Point at night, and I can see that women around me are afraid of me simply because I'm a man, not because of anything I've done, but because of what other men have done. That's bad for those women, but it's also bad for me. If I grow up in a world where I've got, as I do, 4 sisters, and those sisters who I care deeply about are faced with the daily threat of violence, that affects me too. I worry about them, I visit them in hospital, I deal with their anguish and their pain and their trauma. And you don't have to have sisters to feel that concern. If you work with women, if you have friends who are women, the issue of men's violence against women affects all of us. And I think it's really important we name that, because for as long as we continue to treat gender as a women's issue, it lets men off the hook. So I believe, and we at Sonke believe very, very firmly, that men have a responsibility to speak out against men's violence, but men also have a very real investment in speaking out about men's violence.
Dean, I mean, you've got a lot of recognition now for the work that you've done. As you say, you've now moved outside the borders of South Africa. You're going into the continent in 20 countries. You work with the United Nations. You are now an Ashoka Fellow. How has this impacted your personal life? Do you have a personal life? Are you married? Do you have kids? Or is this all you do?
I mean, you're right. Sonke has, I think, been recognized for the good work that we do, and it's been an incredible journey over the last 7 years. I work with truly amazing people, men and women alike, who've been involved in social justice struggles for many, many years. People like Mbuyiselo Botha, who many people in South Africa know, Patrick Godana, Bafana Khumalo, Sisonke Msimang. I work with truly remarkable people. And that's been, the most exciting experience of my life. And it can be pretty all-consuming. It's easy to spend a lot of time sitting on planes, a lot of time sitting in meetings around the world. And that's both exciting and exhausting, of course. But it is the most meaningful and exciting work I've ever done. And I think we at Sonke are bringing about meaningful change as we work with many different organizations in South Africa and across the world. So it's very exciting. And, I remain
But have you found a partner who understands the work that you do? Because, she will have to be very understanding.
Yeah, absolutely. So my partner is also an activist.
Okay.
Natalie works for a group called the Small Arms Survey, was formerly the director of Gun Free South Africa, worked at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation. And so I do think, I've found a partner, a life mate, and we inspire each other, I think. I certainly find, incredible inspiration in the work that she does on criminal justice sector reform, addressing the arms trade, issues of gun violence. And of course, the work that she does is directly related to the work that I do, because when we talk about gun violence, the people who use guns are men. And it's interesting that in South Africa, men use guns against women, but men actually use guns against men far more often. So men kill men in South Africa at 7 times the rate that men kill women. And that's really important for us, because we can say that the way men are socialized in South Africa, to never back down from conflict, to drink, to take risks, puts men at risk and encourages men to treat other men badly and violently. And so we can appeal to men and say, the same processes of socialization that lead and encourage men to use violence against women also put men at risk. And so we can say to men, changing isn't about giving up power, isn't about having a diminished life. Changing is in fact about living a healthier, happier, more fulfilling life.
And Dean, that's where we're going to hold it.
That's a very easy proposition to sell.
Yeah, that's where we're going to hold it. Thank you so much for making the time to chat to us, to share with us your long career. I know you like being more behind the scenes when it comes to Sonke Gender Justice. So thank you for affording us this opportunity to kind of understand the type of men it takes to be able to fight gender inequality.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity.